Welcome to today's panel, where we'll discuss the links between the sustainable use of biodiversity, green businesses, and the current pandemic, as well as the opportunities and priorities for addressing the current challenges in order to guarantee the well-being and prosperity of both the present and future human generations. We're very fortunate today to have an extremely accomplished set of participants. So let me start by providing a brief introduction to them. First, we have Dr. Tom Lovejoy, who's university professor at George Mason University, and is the person who coined the term biological diversity, or biodiversity for short. He's an ecologist with degrees from Yale University and has worked in the Brazilian Amazon since 1965 in the interface of science and environmental policy. He's advised multiple US administrations, the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, and numerous other organizations, including Conservation International, where I'm working. Tom was amongst the first to bring the attention of the world to tropical deforestation in the 1970s. And more recently, he has been a leading researcher in unveiling the risk of the Amazon reaching a tipping point of deforestation that could turn the world's largest tropical forest into largely savanna. We also have Marco Lambertini, the Director General of WWF International, where he works with world leaders, corporate executives, and civil society to forge a future in which people and nature thrive. He sits on the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development. He's an international ambassador of the Food and Land Use Coalition, a founding member of the Nature Action Agenda and Friends of Ocean Action at the World Economic Forum, Business for Nature Coalition, and the Global Commons Alliance. And prior to joining WWF, he served as Chief Executive of BirdLife International, where he coordinated a global partnership of over 120 civil society organizations from all continents. We also have Gregory Watson, Senior Specialist in the Climate Smart Agriculture team at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he has overseen projects related to green microfinance, climate investments, adaptation, biodiversity, blue economy, and forestry. He created the green microfinance program EcoMicro, and he designed the first project for the forest investment program of the climate investment funds in Mexico. Greg holds degrees from both the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and from Tufts University. Then we have Patricia Lombard, the ambassador for the European Union of Colombia. She's a lawyer by training with additional degrees in international trade and European studies. Patricia has extensive experience of several decades working for European Union institutions with a focus on international relations and foreign affairs. As such, she's very familiar with the situation in Latin America and, of course, many other regions of the world. Then we have Dr. Christian Samper, the president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he leads the largest network of urban wildlife parks, including the Bronx Zoo, the New York Aquarium and Central Park Zoo, and a global field conservation program extending to more than 60 countries and all of the world's oceans. Previously, Dr. Samper served as director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and he was the founding director of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute. He also served as chair of the subsidiary body of scientific, technical, and technological advice of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, where he launched the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Dr. Samper holds degrees from the Universidad Los Andes in Colombia and from Harvard University. And finally, we have Ms. Inger Anderson, the executive director of the UN Environment Program. Prior to UN Environment, she was the Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and she held various leadership roles at the World Bank and the United Nations with a strong focus on water, environment, and sustainable development, and with special emphasis on Africa and the Middle East. Ms. Anderson holds degrees from the London Metropolitan University North and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. So to start with, let me ask you, Tom, during COVID, there has been an increase in deforestation across the Amazon and in many other parts of the world. What concrete actions should governments and donors take to prevent further deforestation in the post-COVID period?
So ironically, COVID came from excessive intrusion in nature and wildlife trade, wildlife markets, and to have the COVID moment create opportunities to do more of that is really like sort of shooting ourselves in the foot. So I think it's incredibly important for governments to actually play their proper role, enforce the law, And simultaneously, we need to think about creating a sustainable trajectory for those people that doesn't involve further deforestation.
Thank you, Tom. I think you're absolutely right. It's deeply concerning to see this increase in threats that are actually increasing the risk of future pandemics. Now, Marco, you and WWF and many partners are pushing governments and promoting a new deal for nature. How do you feel that the content of that agreement that was started before this current crisis will have to change to remain relevant, after this COVID crisis?
Thank you. Well, a virus transmitted from a wild animal in a few weeks has brought our global economy on its knees and actually affected the most vulnerable in society. And that has simply highlighted, even more strongly perhaps than many other previous pandemics, the huge risks and costs of our unbalanced relationship with the planet. And I think that plays in strengthening, it makes the narrative and the reason for a new deal for nature and people even stronger by asking the world to really commit by 2030 to enter a new nature positive world. And alongside a carbon neutral world, we'll actually deal with the two big challenges of our society: climate change and nature loss. Climate change, we have a big agreement. On nature loss, we don't. And that's why we're calling for a new deal for nature and people. And the reason why we need this new deal is exactly to prevent issues like the one we've been suffering from so deeply in the last few weeks. Stop losing nature, stop disturbing natural places, protecting species, and particularly in order to do that, green our economy. And paradoxically, this crisis, which has started as a health crisis, but is now really beginning to be even more so an economic crisis, a social crisis, is actually pushing us, but also giving us the opportunity to finally beginning to think, not to go back to normal, but perhaps to move forward to a new normal that is about sustainable development, sustainable use, is about green growth, is about producing food in a sustainable way, is about building cities and infrastructure in a sustainable way that does not impact nature as we've done until now. And so, all the asks of the New Deal, all the key priorities and targets, we feel, and the narrative itself, we feel is going to be even more strengthened by this growing awareness that if we hit nature, nature hits back. And on the receiving end, we are the ones who are going to lose.
Thank you, Marco. And on this point about investments, infrastructure, and thinking of a new way of doing business, Greg, the Inter-American Development Bank is an important funder of sustainable development. And what do you see in terms of what investments development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank will prioritize after COVID to make sure that there is both economic recovery, but at the same time benefits for our climate and for global biodiversity?
Sure, and I'll just start by correcting one thing. I think an old bio was sent. I'm actually an advisor to the manager of climate and sustainability on biodiversity now at the bank. We're basically seeing now demand for sustainable infrastructure projects, food security projects, resilient cities projects, sustainable tourism, and digital transformation projects across the bank. And what we're doing right now is looking towards the recovery phase, and the loans and the grants and the planning projects that the bank will undertake. Obviously, we have a very large kind of response program right now, but as the countries enter the recovery, looking at how we can help them match their NDCs, their biodiversity action plans, their development plans, or infrastructure plans with the economy and job plans that they have for the stimulus. And part of that is looking at the statistics and the numbers and trying to show policymakers that you look at what Stiglitz and Stern published about a week ago, that natural capital ecosystem restoration has a large return on investment, that sustainable agriculture projects also have that return on investment, that IOL is publishing that jobs actually are created in huge numbers in restoration. It was UNDP themselves that showed that every dollar spent on nature creates $9 in recovery. And so, as we're doing our own programming in the bank, trying to mainstream nature-based solutions, into all of these different sectors of the recovery and all of these different sectors of the economy, we need to do the same thing with the ministries of the government as they're developing their stimulus packages. And so, we're trying to start that process now upstream so that when the stimulus packages are deployed and the loans are going out the door later, we actually are incorporating that then.
Thanks for that. And I think that's an important message, that this has to be a whole of government approach and not something that's delegated only to ministries of environment, but also bring in the ministries that might be even better resourced to tackle these challenges. Tom, when we look at the Amazon, the pressure it's under and the opportunity for more sustainable development for the people who live in the Amazon, what kind of economic activities do you see having the greatest potential, to both contribute to conservation and to the economic development for people of the Amazon?
So I think the vision does not include massive infrastructure and all those really old ideas. It really is a vision that uses the natural resources of the Amazon in traditional ways and in new ways. So the potential for a global contribution to aquaculture from the Amazon is actually very, very promising. Those fish species could become as well known as salmon or cod in the future. And as we explore biological diversity scientifically, but doing it in partnership with industry, we can find all kinds of amazing new products in the forest that can be useful to us, as well as maybe once again come up with something that led to the ACE inhibitors, which everybody treating themselves for hypertension depends on.
Great examples for opportunities for a greener future of the Amazon. Now, Marco, the work on the New Deal for Nature has been ongoing for a while. Which part of the world do you see that there is most momentum around the New Deal for Nature, and which parts of the world would you like to see greater commitments from countries or regions to change business as usual?
Well, listen, I think, and that's really quite a paradox, because on one hand, all the indicators of the state of the planet are going down in the wrong direction until now. But science is never clearer than before. Awareness is never greater than before. And frankly, response has never been so high as well. So we're seeing a lot of responses, positive responses to the idea of a strong New Deal for Nature and People that complements the one on climate, that focuses on maintaining, protecting ecosystems, species, biodiversity, and their services. And I think what is really is exciting is to see that nature is now being perceived not anymore only, and it's super important element, but not only as an ethical responsibility for us to coexist with so many beautiful, amazing life forms that share the planet with us, but is actually seen as an indispensable common good, a global good for our society and our economy to thrive. That's really, it is a cultural revolution, if you like. We've been taking nature for granted for most of our history as a species. And now suddenly and finally, we're beginning to realize that actually we are depending on nature much more than nature depends on us. That's a cultural revolution that is underpinning a major concern in society now about nature loss as much as climate change. And therefore, I think creates an environment which is conducive to agreeing to a strong, ambitious set of targets that will, by 2030, lead us to a nature-positive world as much as a carbon-neutral world.
Thanks for that, Marco. And Greg, obviously the Inter-American Development Bank has a long history of financing development in Latin America, and you highlighted kind of some of the shifts or recent focal areas of the bank. But you're also kind of innovating and looking for new ideas, and so you see a lot of those new ideas in your role with the bank. What are the ideas that really excite you, that you think have great potential to kind of really shift things up in the right direction?
Right now, actually looking at the COVID response and biodiversity, one thing I'm really heartened by is pre-COVID, we were working on biodiversity investment funds through second-tier financial institutions where you can blend public and private money to create investment funds for bioeconomy. We're doing this actually right now, designing something in Peru for bioeconomy investments in the Amazon. And what I think has been a challenge in the past is not necessarily having the right kind of financing for businesses all across the chain. You need some risk capital at the early stage. You need kind of loans through financial institutions, microfinance institutions, banks, all the way up to equity investment to be able to cover the whole chain of bioeconomy and regenerative businesses. And now I think we're seeing much more interest both from the public sector, but also from private investors in blending in these vehicles, not just in the project that I'm talking about, but I see seeds of that in other countries too. And so, there's a lot of really interesting innovations taking place that we're working on that are, I'd say, at earlier stages, but really in a systemic change. I'm really excited about these kinds of vehicles that can really help the businesses that are in these zones that are going to be really affected by COVID, where the economy is really going to need to restart. And countries are really approaching us now and saying that bioeconomy is one of the areas that they see as most important for restarting the economies post-COVID in these zones. And so countries are starting to internalize that dialogue and say, for the economy, bioeconomy is the answer in this area. And that's a shift.
That's very encouraging, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that businesses are actually nature positive or planet positive, and not just focus on doing less bad or reducing bad impacts, but actually contributing positively. If we can get to this, it would be a good resulting outcome of how we've taken on board the lesson that this crisis have brought to us. So. Christian, Wildlife Conservation Society has a long history of working with wildlife and conservation initiatives all around the world. What concrete measures do you believe that government must take after COVID to reduce the risk of future pandemics?
Well, thanks, Sebastian, and it's great to be able to join all of you. Indeed, I mean, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been a wake-up call for all of us about the relationship between people and nature. And what we see, of course, is we rely on nature for so many things, our livelihoods, our food and issues, but we've interacted with microbes and viruses throughout our human history. And what we have seen is that the number of these zoonotic diseases has been increasing dramatically. Since 1940, there have been more than 335 different zoonotic episodes that have come, and about 70% of those have come directly from wildlife. So there is an issue, and what we're seeing is the frequency is increasing, tied to the habitat transformation, the fragmentation, and the increase in the interface between humans and people. We think that it is time to really recast our relationship, and we think a core of this needs to be an approach that we call the One Health, which is recognizing the linkage between human health, wildlife health, and environmental health, and looking at those interactions. And in this particular case, we propose 3 specific actions that we think need to be taken to prevent these kinds of cases in the future. First, we've proposed that we need to really reduce the consumption of wildlife for human consumption. This is an important measure because that is the interface, that is the front line, recognizing that, of course, there's local consumption to support local livelihoods. That's an important issue. But closing the wildlife markets for these kinds of species is a first step that needs to be taken. The second issue, of course, is tackling the wildlife trade. We see in an increasingly globalized world, we see more and more species being moved across continents. And we think that it's very important to crack down on these issues because that's an important source of these diseases. And the third issue is really promoting the ecosystem integrity and conservation. We know that if we can really redefine a relationship and protect and restore some of these natural ecosystems, it's a good way of reducing that human interface interaction in a way that will minimize these things.
Thanks, Christian. So, Ambassador Lombard, Christian was outlining the links between these kind of zoonotic diseases and nature. Obviously, this will influence the policy of the European Union moving forward as a consequence of this crisis. So what do these changes imply for the collaboration between the European Union and the countries in regions like Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific?
So thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you very much to International Conservation for giving us this opportunity today to celebrate and commemorate the World Environment Day. I think it's really an important moment, and this year, more in particular, with the circumstances that we are involved on, to raise further awareness and essentially start thinking or continue thinking about taking action. And in this context, I would underline that on the European Union side, there was already a very strong commitment to environmental protection and promotion, and that was reflected essentially very strongly in all the discussions and all the negotiations on the Paris Agreement, and trying to build a very strong not only European Union consensus but international consensus. This was further reinforced with the new leadership that took functions in December last year, when looking at their term in office, they established, and von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, and underlined as one of the 3-4 main priority, the Green Deal. And that was really not an environmental strategy, but an economic and industrial strategy, the growth strategy of the European Union. That was before the pandemic, and obviously we find ourselves in a much different circumstances, and beyond the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the impact that it will bear into our societies, and the impact in the European Union is going to be one of not changing course of action and not deviating from this very major European Union strategy, Green Deal, but on the contrary, to reinforce and accelerate the path of this transformation, of that path of this economic transformation. And this is because we are taking a certain number of lessons. Samper was already mentioning some of them, how vulnerable we feel after this, after the crisis, and how the increase on biodiversity losses make us more vulnerable, but also a certain number of other lessons, like we need to take preventive action. I think if we have learned one of the things is that there are things that cannot be left without any action, because there is no option not to act, as we have maybe done in the past, and maybe it is very difficult. So my first line will be that on the European Union side, the conclusion, even if it's going to be more difficult because pressures will be stronger to go to the old habits of economic production and industrial production, the European Union is taking the lessons and using this, the lessons from the pandemic to change course and enhance and deepen the commitment to a clean and sustainable development strategy. And I can come back a little bit later more, because we started on the European Union side already yesterday with the adoption of two major strategies, one on biodiversity and another one on from farm to fork, that are already describing the way into that new way of economic development.
Thank you, Ambassador. And it's great to hear that there's not only a continued commitment to these progressive policy, but certainly a deepened one as a result of this crisis. Now, Inger, you interact with governments all around the world in your role at the United Nations Environment Programs. Are there specific public policies and actions that you want to see governments implementing, for a nature positive post-COVID economic recovery? Oh, I think you're on mute too.
This is terrible. I probably want to just say that there are a number of commitments that countries have made, and these stand. First of all, the commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this we agreed in 2015, and it's a firm agreement amongst the nations of the world, members of the United Nations, to arrive at a more sustainable world. And that has a number of implications that each state, each nation state, civil society, science, etc., have to take on board. We cannot walk away from that. So if we talk about public policy, there's nothing bigger or broader than that. Secondly, of course, we agreed to the Paris Agreement. And COVID, if it's anything, let us not, I think Joe Stiglitz has said, jumping from the COVID frying pan into the climate fire. Let's not think for a moment that with this little blip of reduction in emissions, that is a victory lap for us to take to the country. The bathtub was already full. Okay, so the water stopped for a few minutes running into the bathtub, but our CO2 budget is full. So we need to make sure that we do not let go of the commitments that we have made. And that will drive green jobs, that will drive green opportunities, and that will drive a much better tomorrow. And let's not forget, and Christian alluded to this, that not taking climate action is not a place where we want to be, because COVID has been and is terrible, catastrophic, awful, and we have lost many, many people. But make no mistake about it, climate change will be something much more different, very much more severe. We will get through COVID, injured and hurt. Climate change, I'm not so sure. So the second point is obviously climate change. Third, these stimulus packages, I've referred to that, they have to be green and smart. Fourth, we need to understand that right now we are massively expanding medical waste, chemical waste, and other waste forms. And many, many countries do not have incineration, do not have safe disposal, do not have safe storage. And unfortunately, open burning, etc., is happening. So protecting our environment from the toxicities that will emerge and the hazardous waste that will emerge from this is all part and parcel of the solutions. But the good news is that if we've learned anything from COVID, and this will be my last point, we've learned that when imminent danger faces humanity, imminent danger, we step in. Never before, we've locked ourselves in. We've locked 4 billion people in, and we've made our economies tank. We have 2 billion children that are not in school. This is of proportions nobody could have imagined. It is that resolve that we now need to take into climate change and into biodiversity. We have had to postpone COP26, but make no mistake, we have to have the ambitious national determined contributions submitted. We've had to postpone COP15 dealing with biodiversity, but this biodiversity COP is the big one, equivalent to COP21, if I may, where we have to come at ambitious agreements. We know that biodiverse regions, we tend to have fewer pathogens transfers from the wild animals to humans, less diverse, more understrained ecosystems, more pathogens transferred into infectious diseases, as Christian was alluding to. More research is needed, but we need to take care of nature. It's time for nature.
Thank you very much for that, Inger. And perhaps to follow up, Christian, you highlighted that one of the key actions specifically relating to reducing the risk of zoonotic disease and future pandemics is wildlife markets. Have you seen that there are countries around the world proactively taking action? Do you think that there are particular countries that it's worth calling out for starting to address this issue in a more urgent way as a result of the current crisis?
Thanks, Sebastian. Yes, I think in the midst of the whole crisis, there is a silver lining. And part of what we're seeing here, for example, the steps that have been taken by China in particular in the last few weeks have been very encouraging. They actually put in place early on in this process a temporary ban on the sale of wildlife in the wet markets, and that's actually been extended now for a temporary ban, for a permanent ban for many species. Not all. There's still some issues that need to be worked out. Vietnam has also signaled that they intend to change their laws, as well as Indonesia. Singapore is looking at it. So we're seeing a number of countries in Asia that are taking steps in this direction. And this, again, is in no way trying to say that we shouldn't trade and do sustainable use of wildlife in any way. But there is a clear issue here where we have to look at those species for human consumption that come from the wild, because there's a real issue and a real chance. That is how you get, there's about over 1 million viruses and bacteria and others in animals. Any one of them could make a jump over. So we need to respond to that. And this ties into reshaping our food habits and our food preferences. I think that's an important issue that will not only be good for people, it'll be good for animals. And by the way, it'll be good for climate. I think there's an opportunity to reshape and recast the future and our relationship with nature.
Thank you, Christian.
Actually, let me put in one more plug, if I may. Ingrid just mentioned the 2021 now, COP of biodiversity. I think that's a great opportunity as we're looking at the agenda for the next 10 years for biodiversity. These are issues that need to be captured and reflected there. And we need to really move ahead with this as the nations of the world and all of the organizations and societies that can support it.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Lombard, you talked about the Green Deal in Europe and the focus on using that for economic development and moving forward. But how will that manifest itself in terms of foreign policy and development assistance? So the relationship between the European Union and other countries around the world.
Thank you for the question, because you are absolutely right. I think one of the elements, as we see from the European Union, it is very important that we do have our very strong and high-level commitments that are reflected on the Green Deal, but also on the different strategies that are being adopted, that we look at the world in a different way. But this cannot be done by ourselves. We will be on the EU side leading by example. We will be changing the way we produce, the way we consume, the way the industries, the way we move through this Green Deal, the way we recycle, we use this recycling economy. But at the same time, we are very, very well aware we cannot do it by ourselves. This is, I think, what put in it. We need to work on the multilateral system. It is essential that we have and promote a strong international cooperation, and this also means solidarity. On the EU side, we are already, with many countries, very committed with a very strong cooperation on the environment, but this has to be even more ambitious. We have very good examples. I'm talking from Colombia, where we have a very ambitious agenda that starts with a strong political dialogue that will let us go to those COP 2021 with more ambitious objectives, and that we really work together with Colombia, for example, so as to have a more ambitious view and work with more countries for the COP 2021, but also in practice, what is working for promoting biodiversity, for avoiding the loss of biodiversity, for working on climate change. So it will be part of our strategic elements of cooperation with third countries, even more reinforced of what has been until now. It is also part, I want to underline, of these Europe team efforts that we are undertaking now to work with the countries after the pandemic, to support the countries as a signal of solidarity and international cooperation. And it will be in the future part and pillar of cooperation with their countries in the multilateral arena, regional cooperation, and also at national level.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Inger, there seems to be very consistent and strong consensus around the importance of the upcoming COP for the Convention of Biological Diversity. Now, these international conventions and negotiations require a lot of in-person discussion and preparation. How can we do that when we're all locked up at home? how can we make sure that we advance the preparation for these milestone meetings in a productive way when we're not able to actually meet each other in person and hash out some of the perhaps more contentious issues?
I think we need to embrace the future and not be afraid of technology. For too long have we thought that we said, oh, we really ought to travel less. We really ought not to. You know what? We all managed to flip the switch immediately to go online. Is it a little more complicated? Yes, but I'll put it to you, traveling 16 hours is darn complicated too, and very expensive, and has a very big CO2 emission. So I think that whilst of course there will be time for getting together, a lot of this can actually be achieved online. In UNEP, we are experimenting, we're calling it sort of flipply multilateral environmental governance 2.0 inside the house, but now I've let it out of the bag. Because and we've done a number of studies, what would it look like? And I think it's next week, the BRS convention, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, which are also conventions that we have the privilege of hosting, have their annual subcommittee and part of their science work online. You saw the World Health Assembly not commenting on the substance of that, but that they ran 6 languages, interpretation, etc., online this very week. We are learning. It is baby steps, but we are learning. So whatever the future throws at us, this will not be a get out of a jail card for free for multilateral commitments and agreements. And we're very, very clear that the COP 15 needs to reach for that level of ambition. And it needs to reach outside the environment bubble. Environment ministers can agree fairly fast amongst one another, but it is bringing in infrastructure, it is bringing in agriculture, it is bringing in finance, it is bringing in the private sector that really matters. And that is a determination we're going to get to. Agriculture, if I may, it's very important to understand that agriculture, if we look at the drivers of loss, according to IPBES, the assessment, the twin to IPCC, if you like, it tells us that agriculture is the biggest driver of terrestrial loss. But agriculture, as Christian was saying, we all have to eat, but it's what we eat and how we go about that we need to have a conversation on. So in 2021, the UN will host the World Food Summit, which will be an important added element to the journey that we are now on. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Inger, and thank you to all the panelists. And I think that's a great closing remark. Conservation and development 2.0 means we all have to do business differently, and we have to take a whole government approach to these issues. This is not just a silo for the ministries of environment to think about, but really something that the whole of society needs to tackle, that we all need to work to collectively. And I think that's a good message to send on World Environment Day this year.